Hello friends, welcome to JavaEE Servlets tutorial. In this sub-series, we are going to see Servlet events. So first we will learn the Servlet events concept. Then we will, in the part 2, we will look at the example. And then in part 3, we will go to Eclipse demo. So first let us look at the Servlet request listener. So these listener objects are useful to handle the events associated to the servlet and web application. Just like the button click event, when button is clicked, the event is notified to a specific component in Java, right? So the same way the listener will be notified when a specific event occurs in the servlet or web application. Now let us look at the Servlet request listener. So the web server can be anything, a Tomcat server or a Wildfly server or WebLogic server. So whatever is the server. So the web server will send servlet request event to servlet request listener. So the servlet request listener will receive this event, and the web server sends this event when these two event happens. That means when a request is initialized and when the request is destroyed. So to know more about it, so we know that a browser will send request, server will process that request, then it will send the response. So a request initialized in the sense the web request initiated from browser and goes to the server. So the moment it reaches the web app, the event 1 occurs. That means the request is initialized here on the server. Then when it is about to send the response, the time the request will be destroyed. So that's the lifetime of a request. The request is received from the browser. It is processed. After the processing, the server sends the response and request object destroyed. So that means when the request is initiated, it will send the request initialized. So this is the servlet request listener, right? So it notifies the servlet request listener at point 1. That means when a request is initialized. Similarly, when it is destroyed, it will notify again the servlet request listener. That means listener will receive the servlet request event 2 times. One is when the request is initialized, and the other one is when the request object is destroyed from the server. Now let us look at the servlet context listener. We know that servlet context objects are common for the all servlet within a web application. Each web application will hold its own servlet context. So we already saw this concept in the previous video series. The previous video in this series. So to reiterate that, servlet context is common for web application, and all the servlet in the web application share that servlet context. So if the web server, say for here we are looking at the Wildfly, right? So if Wildfly is having a 3 web application, then the 3 web application will have 3 separate servlet context. Alright, now let us look at the servlet context listener. So the web server will produce the servlet context event, and the servlet context listener will listen for the event, and it will receive this event at two stages. One is when web application is initialized. So from our previous videos, we know that the servlet context is specific to a web application. That means there is only one servlet context for one web application. So that means the servlet context will be initialized when web app is deployed. And when web app is undeployed or destroyed, that time the context also destroyed. Why? Because the servlet context is specific to a web application. All the servlet in the web application will share this same servlet context. That means the context object will initialized when web application is coming to alive in the web server, and when the web application is destroyed from the web server, the context object also destroyed. So that means when context is created, the notification is sent to Servlet context listener, and the Servlet context listener will receive the Servlet context event when the context object is destroyed. Now we will move to HTTP session listener. Web server will produce the HTTP session event, and the listener is a HTTP session listener which will receive this event. That means it is subscribing to that event, and when that event is produced, it will get notified. So it will get notified in two occasions. One is when a session is created, and other one is a session destroyed. So we know that a session is a user's session. Say for example, let's say user is opening a browser, then he is visiting a page 1. After that, from page 1 he goes to page 2, then page 3, and after visiting page 4 he closes the browser session. So that means here it will produce the session created. In the web browser side, it says that new user session created. So it produces HTTP session event, and it will send that notification to HTTP session listener. So HTTP session listener will get HTTP session event when a new user session is inbound to the web server. Now user is visiting different pages, then he is closing the browser. That means he is ending the session. Here event 2 is inbound at the server, and web server will send a HTTP session event to HTTP session listener, and it states a session destroyed. So the session also destroyed when certain timeout occurs. So even though, let's say, user opens a browser, visits page 2, visits page 3, he doesn't close the session, he gone for lunch, or he doesn't close, he left the browser, let's say like that. And the timeout is configured at web server or at a web application. Let's say the timeout is 15 minutes. And if there is no action from this page 3, this will automatically ends the session. So that time also the listener will get session destroyed event. There are a lot of other listeners also. So since these three sessions are important, we just talked about these three sessions. You can Google it to know more about the listener, but it will give you the concept of how the listener works. So far we discussed about three listener. One is a request and context and session. So in each these objects, that means request object, servlet context object, and HTTP session object, we can add and remove attributes. That means we can set the attributes and we can get the attributes. So we saw that in the previous videos. So there is a listener for the attributes also. Let's say attributes listener, and this is actually not a class name. Attribute listener in the sense attributes for a specific object. Say for example, the listener will come like this: HTTP session attribute listener. That means the attribute listener is for HTTP session. So when we talk about attribute listener, these attribute listeners will produce a specific event for the attribute that we are watching. So we will not name it. Why? Because there are various attribute listener. But when we look at the action, let's say the attribute is for request, or we can consider other object also, session. So we will say request attribute, session attribute, and context attribute, right? So we can create a servlet context, then we can set attributes and get attributes. Same goes for session and request. We saw all this in the previous videos. So we can set and get attributes on this object. That means we can add an attribute using set attribute. We can remove the attribute using a remove attribute method, and we can replace the attribute. That means if we add an attribute to the existing attribute, then the value is replaced for the specific attribute. There are three kind of action, and the listener specific to the attribute will get notified when these three action takes place. Say for example, HTTP session attribute listener, and when you add attribute to the HTTP session, you will get notified for add. Similarly, when you remove, there will be a corresponding listener function for that, and when you replace, there will be a corresponding listener function for that. So in the next video, we will talk about the example that we will create to understand. So we will create example in the next coming videos. We will understand how servlet request listener works, then HTTP session attribute listener will work. So we will experiment these two, and other stuff you can experiment yourself, as the concept goes almost similar for the other objects. So one is the request listener and one is the listener for a specific attribute. So in an object we can set attribute, right? We can set a listener for that also. That's all here in this video. Thank you for watching. Bye.